Okay, welcome back. If you are here, this is actually a bonus episode that is not part of the main numbered series. This is basically going to be me going off on a tangent because I don't want to end up going off on a tangent for, I believe, the fourth episode. Yes. So this is like a complimentary to that episode. And I'll refer in the fourth episode that if you want more detail, come here because we are about to like really go off the rails into some deep political conversations, okay? So, I just want to kind of go into a deep dive about the political machinery side of the People's Temple because I just feel like honestly, the more I research this, the more I realize that this is part of the Jonestown story that nobody really told you about in the documentaries. Because they'll give you the Kool-Aid, which is really Flavor Aid. They'll give you the jungle, Jim Jones and the glasses, but skip a lot of the entire reason that he was untouchable for so long, which was actually politics. So, buckle up. This is going to be a long one. We're going to go into some politics today. So, let's talk about the machine that built the cult. So, a political machine, not a conspiracy. It's an organization that can, like, literally deliver bodies. Okay. So, when you hear the phrase, as I'm using it, political machine, I feel like it's typically thrown around like an insult, but it's not really an insult. It's the more I look into it, the more it feels like it's just a description of a thing that has existed in American politics since basically the Civil War. And like I said, it's not a conspiracy or like a smoke-filled room of evil men plotting on how to ruin democracy. It's really an organization that can do one specific thing, which is literally deliver bodies. It makes me think about Better Call Saul and some of the tactics he would put up to try to like get his way for certain things. Like I remember there was the black guy who got arrested, and Saul pulled this whole scheme to get him unarrested and like literally found a way to deliver bodies, to write a crap ton of letters and phone calls, and just like he put on like a big like illusion, a big show in a sense. And that's kind of a little bit like what Jim Jones was able to do. He was able to deliver bodies on demand to the polls, to a rally, to a phone bank, on a bus, seats at a fundraiser. That is like literally the entire job of the machine, turn people out in numbers, and it counts. And the reason that is so valuable, the reason why politicians will bend over backwards to be friends with the machine, is because elections are won and lost on turnout. And turnout is the hardest thing in politics to produce. To actually get us to show up, and then not only show up, but to show up and show up for you is difficult for a politician to be able to do. Because you can run all the ads in the world, you can knock on all the doors, but if the people that you want to vote for you do not actually show up on election day, you lose. But a machine guarantees that they show up. So that's the frame. Hold on to it. We're going to come back to it. So the original American political machine, the one that every other machine in American history is basically a copy of, is, I swear, hold on, give me a second. Let me Google how to pronounce this again, because my brain wants to say Tammany, but it's not. I'm gonna start like putting like parentheses and like the written like pronunciation, like the phonetics basically. But Tammany. Okay. So Tammany Hall. That is what we're about to be talking about right now. So Tammany Hall, just like lost my notes. Okay. So Tammany Hall basically was a political machine that basically ran New York for about 100 years, from roughly the 1850s through the 90s. And its peak power was in the late 1800s. And it was technically the New York County Democratic Party Committee, but in practice, it's actually something a little bigger and weirder than that. So it basically ran what's called a patronage system. The way it worked was, um, and I just find this so interesting, but this is the way it worked. So if you were a poor immigrant, usually Irish, you would get off of a boat at Ellis Island in 1890. You would have no English, job, housing, friends, no idea how anything worked. And a man from Tammany Hall would just show up at the docks. And this man would help you for real. He would find you an apartment, get you a job, offer the city job like sanitation or police or fire. And he would help you get your citizenship paperwork done. He would help you when your kid got sick. He would show up at your wedding and at your funeral. He would put a turkey on your table at Thanksgiving, bail your cousin out of jail. He would be, in a very real way, the only entity in your entire life that has ever consistently done right by you. And in exchange, you voted how Tammany Hall told you to vote every election for the rest of your life. And so did your wife and your kids when they came of age, and your cousin and everybody on your block who got the same help. And Tammany Hall would deliver those votes in bulk on command to whichever candidate they decided to back. And that candidate would win. And that candidate would then hand out city contracts and jobs and favors to Tammany Hall. And Tammany Hall would use that money and those jobs to help more immigrants who would then vote how Tammany Hall told them to vote. And the whole machine just kind of kept rolling for decades. The most famous Tammany Hall boss was a guy, I didn't find a picture of him actually, but he's a guy named William Boss Tweed. And in the 1860s and 70s, he was eventually arrested for massive corruption. I can never talk. But he was arrested for massive corruption. I was about to say corruption. Because the machine also stole enormous amounts of money from the city through inflated contracts, and they basically got kickbacks. So Tammany Hall has a reputation today as basically a corruption synonym. Like if you call something Tammany Hall politics, people will hear crooked, old school backroom dealing in a sense. But the thing that historians have actually spent the last 40 or 50 years trying to get people to understand is that guess what? The machine actually worked for the people it served, because the Irish immigrants who got Tammany Hall help in 1890 were not being scammed. They were getting real housing and jobs and protection and real help that the official government of the United States was refusing to give them. Basically, the machine was filling a gap that the formal welfare state did not exist to fill yet. And in exchange, those people gave their political loyalty, and they gave it gladly because the alternative was nothing. But the temple delivered real material help to poor people that the government was not providing. See where the connections come in at? Care homes, clinic visits, bus rides, scholarships, legal aid, groceries. In exchange, the temple delivered votes and turnouts to candidates like George Moscone, and those candidates delivered protection and appointments and access back to the temple. And it's basically the same transactional structure as Tammany Hall, just transplanted to San Francisco in the 1970s and kind of wearing a church suit instead of a ward boss suit. And I think that's why this comparison matters, because it tells you that the People's Temple was not unique or weird or unprecedented in how it politically operated. But instead, it was running a classic American urban political machine the same way Irish immigrants in New York have been running them for hundreds of years before. The only thing that made the temple different was that the guy at the top went off the rails in a way that Boss Tweed, for instance, never did. And instead of just stealing money and dying in prison, like Tweed eventually does, Jim Jones kills everybody. So, like I said, the People's Temple operationally was a political machine in a Tammany Hall sense. You know, just because a lot of people in 2026 don't understand what a political machine actually is, it's just not a conspiracy. It's an organization, like I said, that can deliver bodies to the polls, to the rallies, to a candidate's living room, to a march, even like bodies in a seat at a fundraiser so that the room looks full. And in San Francisco in the 1970s, almost nobody could be delivering bodies anymore. Like, it just wasn't a thing. The old machine unions were fading. The old ward healers were dying off. The Democratic Party was in a transition between the old Burton machine, and I'll talk about that more in a second, and a new coalition that would eventually become like the Pelosi, Boxer, Feinstein power structure. And right in the middle of that transition, you get a preacher who walks in from the country and says, I have 2,000 people who will get on a bus tomorrow and go wherever you tell them to go, and they will vote however I tell them to vote. And I'm offering this to you. And so, as you can consider and guess, every politician in California took that meeting. Because that's the whole thing. They did not take the meeting because they were stupid or corrupt or because they had been hoodwinked by this like charismatic con man. Instead, they took the meeting because that was their job. And the job of an elected Democrat in California in 1975 was to find the organizations that could turn out voters and build alliances with them. And the People's Temple was the most disciplined turnout operation in the city of San Francisco. And every serious politician in the state knew it. And they all behaved exactly the way you would expect them to behave, given that information. So don't think that these politicians were dupes. They weren't. They were operators making rational political decisions based on the information available to them. And then the information available to them was that the People's Temple was a high-functioning progressive organization with a turnout operation that nobody else had. That's the frame. So now I've talked about that a little bit. Let's get into a little more of the individuals. So before we get to Moscone, and I could be pronouncing that wrong, but Moscone and Milk, Harvey Milk, I want to talk about the Burtons first, because the Burtons were the backdrop of everything that happened politically with San Francisco and the temple at this time. So Philip Burton was a congressman from San Francisco. He had been in the office since 1964. By the mid-1760s, he had become one of the most powerful liberals in the entire U.S. House of Representatives. He almost became the Speaker of the House in 1976, and he ran, which was, without question, the dominant Democratic political organization in San Francisco. So the Burton machine also included his brother, John Burton, who was also a congressman, later a state senator. It also included Willie Brown, a state assemblyman who would later become the Speaker of the California Assembly and the mayor of San Francisco. And it also included George Moscone, state senator and then the mayor, and a whole network of younger operatives and electors who owed their careers to the Burton patronage. And you see, the Burton machine, it needed turnout. The Burton machine got turnout from the People's Temple, and therefore the Burton machine protected the People's Temple. So when the defectors started talking, when the New West magazine investigation, it broke in 1977, the IRS started stiffening around. The concerned relatives started writing letters to congressmen. The Burton machine consistently dragged its feet on doing anything about it because Jim Jones was an asset. And you don't throw an asset overboard just because, for them, some former members are unhappy. And this is not a conspiracy. This is machine politics 101 that I'm learning. And it is the reason the abused members of the temple had no political recourse for years. The people they would have complained to were the people who depended on the temple for votes. You see what you know what I'm saying? But that is really the basic logic for here. So let's talk about him for a second, because I think he's kind of like the main case study. He ran for mayor in 1975 against a conservative Italian-American supervisor named John Barbagletta, and I know I said that wrong. It's Barbagleta, if I even spelled that right. But the race was extremely close. They had to go to a runoff in December 1975, and Moscone won by about 4,400 votes. And every credible historian has looked at that race, including people who were inside both campaigns at the time, agrees that the People's Temple delivered more than that margin in turnout. Temple members, they were working the phone banks. They were bringing voters to polling places. They went door to door in the Fillmore and the Western Edition. The Temple newspaper, People's Forum, it endorsed Moscone, and it was distributed all over the city. Moscone, just no doubt about it, he won because of the Temple. And in machine politics, you have to, baby boy, you have to pay up. Pay what you owe, okay? And so, how did Jim get repaid? Well, in October of 1976, Moscone appointed Jim Jones to the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. And when I say this and what happens, then maybe you'll understand a little bit of why I talked about the Tammany Hall politics at the beginning as well. But he appoints him, Jim Jones, to the San Francisco Housing Authority Commission. And in 1977, he becomes the chairman. And this is not some ceremonial job. This is not a thank you plaque. Oh, no. If you're not familiar, the Housing Authority, that is a real position with real power, because the Housing Authority controls thousands of units of public housing in San Francisco. So the chairman gave Jones real patronage power, real ability to direct contracts, to direct hiring. And Jones, you know it, used all of this. He installed temple members on the staff. He used the position to recruit new members from the public housing population. And he used it to make himself more legitimized with the broader political establishment. Because now Jim Jones wasn't just a preacher, baby girl. He was a public official. And when the New West article hit in August of 1977 and the wheels started coming off, Moscone, he issued a statement basically saying the mayor's office had no evidence of wrongdoing and that Jones had, hey, served the city well. He did not immediately ask for the resignation, but Jones eventually stepped down a few weeks later on his own terms. And guess what? Mr. George, He publicly thanked him for his service. He said, "Thank you." Now, he was later assassinated by Dan White on November 27th, 1978, which is 9 days after Jonestown. He was a former supervisor. He walked into City Hall. He shot Moscone in his office. Then he walked down the hall and he shot Harvey Milk. And this happened 9 days after Jonestown. The city of San Francisco was still in the morgue identifying the Jonestown bodies when the mayor, who had appointed Jim Jones, gets murdered in his own office by a different unrelated situation, which is like trauma compounding. Some of the temple defectors and survivors have talked about how the city was so saturated in death during this time frame that nobody had the bandwidth to properly process Jonestown because Moscone and Milk were happening on top of that. And so now, speaking of Milk, oh wait, did I forget Milk? Yeah, I did. I did forget him for a second. But he's going to be in the other part. But I can talk about him real quick. He is a kind of a folk hero in 2026, and so I kind of like want to be a little careful, a little bit. And I should kind of want to be careful about a lot of people, like even talk about Willie Brown and Angela Davis. Harvey Milk did attend People Temple services. I have a picture of him. I could just put it up right here. Oops. I know I have a picture of Mr. Harvey Milk if I can remember. Yep, there we go. There we go. That is Harvey Milk. There you go. Mr. Milk, he attended the People's Temple service, spoke from the People's Temple pulpit. He wrote letters of support, and he used the temple turnout in his own campaign. The temple was actually a key piece of the coalition that finally got him elected supervisor in 1977. And he actually wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter in February 1978, where he was defending Jim Jones in the context of the Stowens custody battle over little John Victor Stowen, which we'll get to in a second. In the letter, actually writes in support of Jones against the Stowens and used language that when you read in hindsight is kind of really embarrassing because the kid that the letter is about was actually being held in Jonestown against his mother's wishes, and he would die there 10 months later. Now, of course, Milk didn't know this. Milk thought he was helping a progressive ally fight off a custody battle case by a defector, but Milk was wrong. And Milk would not live long enough to have to publicly reckon with how wrong he was because he was murdered 9 days after Jonestown. So it's just very interesting. I don't want to let him off the hook, but I also don't want to crucify him. He was a working politician inside a coalition, and the temple was just part of that coalition. And he was just doing kind of in a sense what coalition partners do. He was defending the ally. It's just the ally turned out to be a monster. And I just think that's kind of the lesson, right? Coalition politics requires you to defend people who, in a sense, you can't see their private lives. And every politician in America, they do this every day. And every once in a while, one of them could be turned out to be a little Jim Jones, you know what I'm saying? And you cannot retroactively make the coalition partner clean. So it's like I don't know. How do you avoid not being a little dirty with politics? You just don't do politics, maybe? I don't know. I don't have the answer. I don't have any answers. I'm just talking about history. Moving along. Oh, but there's actually something else about Harvey Milk too. He is kind of like a saint of the LGBTQ rights movement. There's actually a whole movie about him and a whole day about him. And a lot of people historically have not wanted to hear about the fact that Harvey Milk was up in the Jim Jones business. But yeah, like I said, you can only really learn from it. But that is not where you were supposed. There we go. Let's talk about Mr. Willie Brown. Mr. Willie Brown. So at a testimonial dinner for Jim Jones in September of 1976, Willie Brown gets up to the podium and describes Jones, and I'm paraphrasing this because the exact wording varies in different sources, if you will. But the gist is very well documented. So Willie Brown basically says that Jim Jones is what you get when you combine Martin Luther King, Angela Davis, who we'll talk about in a second, Albert Einstein, and Chairman Mayo. And this is a real line. This is on record. It got reported in the press at the time as a triumph, not as a warning sign. Nobody in 1976 heard that line and went, oh, wait, this is a really weird thing to say about a preacher. No, everybody in 1976 heard of it and said, man, Jim Jones guy, he must really be something. And Willie Brown in 1976 was the rising star of California Democratic politics. He would go on to be the Speaker of the California Assembly for 15 years. He would be the mayor of San Francisco for 2 terms. He is one of the most powerful Black politicians in American history. And in 1976, he was exactly the kind of figure whose endorsement of Jim Jones gave the temple political legitimacy that no amount of money could buy. And after Jonestown, Brown did survive politically, partially because he was too important to the California Democratic Party to be sacrificed, and partially because his association with Jones was no worse, and I want to stress that, no worse, than about a half a dozen other prominent Democrats. And you kind of can't like throw them all overboard at once. And, to give it to him, he has spoken about it over the years, sometimes with regret, and sometimes with the standard, we did not know what was happening behind closed doors defense. And I think that both are true. I don't think he knew. I absolutely believe he did not know, but he also enabled. And that's just like the sad truth about it. It's kind of like where I said the same thing about Harvey Milk, and it's probably gonna be about same thing I'm gonna say about Miss Angela Davis. I have a lot of respect for like some of the people I'm talking about. And so when I recognize some names, I don't know a lot about history, but when I recognize some names that like I do know and I'm familiar with, that I like kind of like have like just ingrained respect for, it throws me off myself. But yeah, Dimily. Is it Dimily? Dimily. Dimily. I think it's okay. So Mervyn Dimily. Let's go a little bit higher up the food chain. So Mervyn Dimily, if I'm saying that correctly, he was the lieutenant governor of California from 1975 to 1979. And he was the highest ranking black politician in California state government at the time. And he was closely aligned with the temple. In 1977, Dimily actually went to Jonestown in Guyana in the jungle. He toured the agriculture project, met with the residents. He had his picture taken with Jim Jones. I don't know if I found that. Anyway, he went home and he told the press that it was a wonderful socialist experiment. And this was an enormous visit because if the lieutenant governor of the most populous state in the United States shows up at your jungle commune and tells the world that it is a beautiful project, you have political cover that no magazine investigation can fully strip away. And so Jones cites the Dimily visit over and over in the year leading up to the deaths as proof that the project was legitimate. I say legitimate. But Dimily lost his reelection bid in 1978, and the election was actually days before Jonestown happened. So he was actually already out by the time the bodies got counted. He came back as a congressman and he served for years and he died in 2012. And he never fully reckoned in public with what the Jonestown visit had meant. Okay, so this is where it gets a little federal. Rosalynn Carter, she was the first lady of the United States. She met Jim Jones at a Democratic Party event in San Francisco on September 25th, 1976, during the Carter Mondale campaign. And Jones was seated next to Mama at the head table. And the temple basically mobilized hard for the Carter campaign. And Jones was treated like the local Democratic Party, heavyweight who delivered the goods. There are photographs of them two together. Rosalynn sent him a thank you note afterwards. Jones kept that note and showed it to the people for the rest of his life as a proof of his legitimacy. And then Carter Mondale, the vice presidential nominee at the time, who would go on to be the vice president of the United States, met privately with Jim Jones on his campaign plane. What do you say, huh? Like he met with him on his campaign airplane in June of 1976 in San Francisco. Just the two of them. Mondale wanted that temple turnout, and Jones, he wanted access to the vice president, and they literally got each other. And after Carter and Mondale won the election, the temple had a direct line into the White House on certain issues. Now, it wasn't a huge line, and it wasn't an unlimited line. Like you couldn't just do whatever he wanted, but he had a line. This is their letters got read, their phone calls got returned. The White House returned their phone calls. That's the big deal. Federal attention got generated when the temple wanted federal attention generated. And after Jonestown, the Carter House, White House, did exactly what every other politician did, which was, child, we're going to scrub this connection as fast as humanly possible. Scrub, scrub, scrub. Like the photo with Miss Rosalynn Carter became an embarrassment. The thank you note became a problem. The Mondale meeting got minimized. Nobody in the Carter administration was culpable for Jonestown, but the entire Democratic establishment has spent 4 years legitimizing the man who did it. And the post Jonestown scramble, I think, is its own kind of revealing because nobody in any of those offices stood up and said, we took the meetings, we took the turnout, we owe a public accounting. Instead, they just kind of said, we had no idea, which is technically true, but I also think is a little bit morally insufficient, if you just ask me. So this was, okay, yeah. I can't pronounce his last name. Joseph Freitas. We should call him Joseph, okay? Mr. Joe. So I think this is a little bit one of the most insane, like, single fact in the entire political dimension of the story. All right, so Joseph, Mr. Joseph, was elected district attorney of San Francisco in 1975 on the same progressive wave that brought Moscone in. And the temple supported Mr. Joseph's campaign, and after he was elected, he hired Tim Stoen. Now, Mr. Tim Stoen is the People's Temple's chief lawyer. He's their general counsel. So, let's talk about whole blue global, like, conflict of interest and a lot of other stuff, because just like, okay, so we'll stay on the slide. Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a long section of this, okay? But I'm going to back it up actually because I want to talk about Stoen for a second. So before Stoen, actually, let me explain what's on this slide first. So this is little Victor. This is like the kid I was talking about, where the one politician wrote a letter defending because Tim Stoen had defected at this point. And Victor, this is Victor, and this is Victor and Jem, unfortunately. Jem does end up taking little Victor with him to Guyana, and he is one of the victims. Jem was never going to let him go, Victor. He was never going to, no, he was never going to let him go. But let's talk about Stoen for a second, okay? So, and I'm not even going to be talking about Stoen as that much of a member because he like signs his kid away to Jim Jones. It's like it's just a lot. It's a lot. But before Stoen ever set foot in the San Francisco DA's office, he had already been a prosecutor for years in Mendocino County. Probably pronounced that wrong. But this is the county where the temple's mother church was located. And this is just a huge original conflict of interest. But by the end of 1969, when violence erupted in Berkeley over People's Park and Third World students' rights, Stoen began to integrate his personal life with the temple, basically. And in 1970, Stoen moved to the temple's headquarters, where he worked as a deputy district attorney and head of Mendocino's County Civil Division. And he begins providing legal aid for the temple and politically converted to the temple socialist ideology. And now his job in Medici, I'm probably saying this wrong, but his job in was not a small job. According to his own resume, as assistant district attorney for this county, he was the regular legal advisor to the board of supervisors. He was the chief civil trial lawyer for the county. He was advised to the sheriff, surveyor, agriculture director, building inspector, health department, planning department, public works director, auditor, controller, and the supervisor of 3 other lawyers. So essentially, he was the entire civil legal infrastructure of the county that hosted Jim Jones' headquarters. He advised the sheriff. He advised the boards of supervisors. He was the chief civil trial lawyer for the county. Like, isn't that crazy? And the kicker, from his own resume in that same era, he listed himself as chairman, board of directors, People's Temples Christian Church, River Valley, California. He put on his resume. He was not hiding the dual role. The county knew, everybody knew, and nobody did anything about it because Stoen was politically protected, and nobody locally, they didn't want the smoke, they didn't want the fight. So it's just very interesting because I was like wondering, like, was he getting people off for Jim? So according to Rudderman and I believe maybe Jacob is the co-author, there's a book called Raven, which is like the definitive temple book. But according to them, Tim's presence in the DA's office, it discouraged people, including temple members, from filing complaints against the temple. That's the mechanism. When I was like wondering, like, is he getting people off for like Jones? But it's interesting because the mechanism is like a little bit more subtle and more effective than just getting somebody off. Because basically, if you were a temple member who had been beaten in a planning commission meeting, because they did that, we'll talk about that at one point, or a neighbor who had a problem with the temple like bus running over your fence or something like that, this happened, who are you going to complain to? The DA's office, right? But that's where Stoen works. And this is where Stoen is openly the chairman of the church board. So you're not filing that complaint. Nobody's filing those complaints. The appearance of access to law enforcement would end up blocking law enforcement. And so Stoen himself, in his own memoir and interviews, I feel like he's tried to thread this needle by claiming that he kept the role separate. The summary of his defense, as documented, is that Stoen has explicitly acknowledged the duality, and he will state that he prioritized his being a prosecutor, that career, while committing temple activities, which included drafting legal documents and defending the group against external critics, like anybody outside of the group. And during this period, Stoen handled general criminal prosecutions, but he avoided direct involvement in cases involving temple members, reflecting an implicit conflict of interest due to his loyalty to Jones. So his history is basically, when you want to really boil it down, is I've never personally prosecuted or declined to prosecute a temple matter. I recuse myself by avoiding those cases. And that's technically true, maybe, but technically true and ethically meaningful are not the same thing, right? Because the chilling effect of his presence in the office was the whole point from Jones' perspective. Jones did not need Stone to fix individual cases. Jones needed nobody to bring cases in the first place. And Stone's job title accomplished that. And I think there's also a darker dimension that comes from Stone's own books. I'm not reading it all. But actually, I want to take this from a review of his memoir. Jones, in essence, took control over the Ukiah community by having temple members in lots of areas of government. He even sent members out in force to courtrooms, in a sense, kind of like, to me, a little bit like Better Call Saul type of energy. But he sent members out and forced the courtrooms, in essence, to try to intimidate judges on behalf of defendants. Besides Ukiah, Jones had offices in Los Angeles and San Francisco. He also had a publishing business, a fleet of 11 Greyhound-sized buses, which he could dispatch, full of temple. Y'all know it's one thing to have a bus, to have 12 buses, 11 buses. It's nothing to be able to pull them homeboys up, okay? That was a whole nother thing. And Jones could do it. And he could do it and have them carry out whatever political mission he gave them. And they would execute. Like, Jones sent temple members and forced the courtrooms to intimidate judges on behalf of defendants. That's really witness tampering, right? And jury tampering and judicial intimidation, all of which are serious crimes. And they were happening in the courthouse where Tim Stone worked. And Tim Stone knew about it because Tim Stone helped run the operation. And you can't have it both ways. You can't be the chief civil lawyer for the country, for the county, and also the chairman of the church board whose members are packing the courtroom to intimidate judges and later say you kept the roles separate. I think the roles were the same roles. And now let's get to the San Francisco part where the conflict goes from small town corruption to citywide corruption, okay? Because we're going to be talking about Tim for a second, okay? For a little second, for about 5, 10 more minutes, okay? So if you're here with me, buckle up. Or don't buckle, because if you're here with me, you're probably not buckling. I don't have a buckle. I'm sitting in my seat in my room. Anyway, so following the 1975 mayoral election, former San Francisco District Attorney Joseph, remember him? Right there. He names Stone to lead a special unit to investigate election fraud charges. Shortly thereafter, Mr. Joseph hires Stone as an assistant district attorney in the Consumer Frauds Division. 1975 mayoral election is the election the temple is alleged to have rigged for Moscone. And the man Joseph hired to investigate the election fraud allegations was the general counsel of the organization accused of committing the fraud. Like, you could not write this in fiction. I feel like an editor would be like, this is way too on the nose, my love. Like, let's switch it up. Let's do something else, okay? But the outcome was exactly what you would expect, right? Stone, he found no fraud evidence. But temple members later allege that the temple arranged for busloads of members to be transported from Redwood Valley to San Francisco to vote in that election under threats of physical violence. So when they asked how Jones could know who they voted for, one member actually said, "You don't understand. We wanted to do what he told us to do." Later on, Stone later claimed that he wasn't even aware at that time of election fraud. He said, "What? Who said that?" Despite being in charge of the special unit investigating that specific charge. So it's just so interesting because if you have the question, was Jim leveraging Tim's role? He was, but it's insane and interesting because the leverage was structural, not transactional. Jones never actually needed Stone to fix a specific case. Jones needed the investigation of the temple's election fraud to be conducted by the temple's lawyer, and that's exactly what happened. And the investigation, as you would guess, found nothing. And after the election fraud unit closed with no findings, Joseph, Mr. Fietas or something, hires Stone as the assistant district attorney in the Consumer Frauds Division. And Stone's own resume from that period lists his current position as assistant district for city and county of San Francisco with primary current assignment, supervise voter fraud prosecutions. And there's even like a handwritten edition that says supervise special prosecutions, organized crime. Sir, so far, no offense, but you have not shown me, shoot, I can't think of his name. Oh my gosh, I love them so much and I can't think of their name. I can't. Why can I not? I'm thinking about Law and Order, Organized Crime, and uh my brain's just like completely blanking. When I'm like doing this, I can only like I only have room for like what I'm talking about. Elliot Stabler. Elliot Stabler. Elliot Stabler. Mr. Stabler of Law and Order, Organized Crime. Uh, they made a whole Law and Order franchise to bring your boy back. But anyway, so what was I talking about? Organized crime. Organized crime. A handwritten note. Organized crime. Yes. So he was basically running voter fraud prosecutions and organized crime prosecutions in San Francisco while serving as the general counsel of the People's Temple, which itself is an organized criminal enterprise engaged in voter fraud. Like, I cannot stress how bonkers this is. And the one defense of Stone on the San Francisco piece, I think, is that Stone was loaned, quote unquote, to San Francisco City and County in 1975 to prosecute voter fraud after a large scale scandal surfaced. So the original mechanism was a loan from Mendicino. It wasn't supposed to be a direct hire, but you still have the same effect. And in February 1977, he resigned the San Francisco DA job. He resigned a position as assistant district attorney and special prosecutor for the city of San Francisco to go to the People's Temple Agricultural Mission in Guyana, America. But then 4 months later, he defected from the temple. So the San Francisco district attorney window is roughly late 1975 through early 1977, about 15 months. But 15 months is enough to bury an election fraud investigation, which was the point. So it's just so interesting because, like I said, again, my original question was like, was Stone personally getting people off? Because I was just very fascinated by this big conflict of interest. And to find out the answer is like based on the available record, it's not directly in the direct like it's called quid pro quo sense. And there's no documented case where you can find where Stone walked into a courtroom and personally dismissed a charge against a temple member or filed a charge that benefit Jones personally. But his own defense is actually that he has nothing to hide and he can show no one can show a single instance where he even used his public office to show favoritism towards the church. But the structural corruption is the corruption, right? The point of having your lawyer inside the DA's office is not to fix the individual cases. It's like for the information flow because Stone would know what investigations were live, what complaints that came in, what defectors were talking to law enforcement. He could basically warn Jones in real time. And the temple's response to threats, they were always preemptive. And a big reason it could be preemptive is that Stone was inside the building where the threats originate. And then, like, deterrence. In the book Redeman puts it that his presence discouraged complaints. Victims are not going to file complaints with the boss's lawyer. Like, they're just not. And then also, like, legitimacy is another thing. Having the temple's general counsel be a sitting prosecutor, it just tells a story, like, to every Bay Area institution that the temple is legit. You got banks, landlords, regulators, the press. They're going to all calibrate their behavior to the official posture of the law enforcement, right? So when law enforcement employs your own general counsel, your own man, every other institution is going to be like, bruh, untouchable. And then the voter fraud investigation specifically, like that, to me is a smoking gun. That's a direct case where Stone used his office to protect the temple by being the investigator of the very fraud the temple committed, and he found nothing. I think that is the closest thing to being a documented getting them off that we have. And it's enormous because the underlying fraud was the fraud that put Moscone in the office in the first place. See, that's why I'm getting here. Okay. That's why I had to do this whole second part. Because if not, I'm gonna talk about it in the next part. And we ain't got no room for that. So we're gonna talk about it here in this bonus episode. Okay? Anyway, getting back to it. I get worked up. I'm sorry. I need to calm down. So Moscone, like I said, they put him in office. I'm about to say we, child. I ain't do nothing. Then appoints Jones to the housing authority, like I said, and then that appointment is what gives Jones the political cover he needed to keep operating in San Francisco for another 2 years. The entire downstream catastrophe, it runs through Stone's no finding report, if you ask me. Then I just gonna go to another side note tangent, and I want to talk about the legal ethics questions. Like, what did this actually violate? Because I believe, and I'm no lawyer, even though in the other video I'm gonna pretend to be a fake lawyer, but I'm no lawyer, okay? But I like to read a little bit of a law. And I believe that what Stone was doing was a vagrant violation of legal ethics in 1975, just like it would be in 2026. And that the only reason he got away with it was that the people who would have enforced the rules chose not to. So in the 1970s, let's talk about some of the relevant frameworks. There is something called the California Rules of Professional Conduct. And this is specifically the rules around conflicts of interest. A lawyer cannot represent a client in a matter where the lawyer has a personal or organizational interest adverse to the client. Stone's client, technically, as a prosecutor, is the people of the state of California. And his other client, technically, is the People's Temple. So when the people of California have an interest in investigating the People's Temple, which they did every day Stone was in office, Stone has a direct disqualifying conflict. He should have recused himself from anything temple adjacent, and the DA's office should have walled him off from all temple adjacent information, and we know ain't none of them things happen. And then let's talk about something called the ABA Model Code of Professional Responsibility, which California has adopted versions of, and explicitly forbids the appearance of impropriety. And Stone's situation is like the textbook's appearance of impropriety. It literally is taught in legal ethic classes for years afterwards of what example not to do, apparently. So I ain't wrong. And then we have our conflicts of interest under California Government Code. These are sections that govern public employees, and a public employee cannot have a financial or personal interest in a matter before their agency. And Stone, as a chairman of Temple Board, had a personal interest in every matter touching the temple. This alone should disqualify this man from this San Francisco voter fraud investigation, but it did not, because Mr. Joseph, he didn't give a damn. And then there's the bar discipline. The California bar could have and should have investigated Stone for dual representation. But in the 1970s, they did not at any point, despite the fact that Stone's dual role was openly published on his own resume and in newspaper coverage of the temple. Even after Jonestown, the state bar did not pursue serious discipline against Stone. He kept his license and kept practicing, and he continued to work as a deputy district attorney in Mendocino County, California, where he was assigned to the district attorney's Fort Bragg office. And then Stone later joined the Mendocino County Public Defenders, and he's now in the private practice of law. And he went on to be a prosecutor again and again in subsequent decades. And the reason he was never disciplined is, frankly, I believe that he was so useful to the prosecution of the post-Jonestown cases, because Tim turned and testified. And he also, lost a kid in the whole situation as well. And it's debatable for a lot of people on if this kid was biologically Jim Jones or Tim Stone's, because there's a lot of stuff going on in the back end, and Jim would say as part of their religion that he could sleep with whoever he wanted to sleep with at times, and I do believe that Grace, which is Tim's wife, was one of those people. So, and they do, that's kind of why I include the picture of Jim with Victor, because they do look alike, but then also include a picture of just Victor because he's so cute. He's so cute. That is just the cutest kid. Yeah, so isn't a lot, but basically Tim, he filed civil suits against the temple, and he was the most knowledgeable witness against the temple in the world, basically. And the legal system, it protects its useful informants. So the same institutional incentives that protected him inside the temple era DA's office are also the same. But yeah, so they're also the same that protected him after he flipped. Because he was just way too valuable to even discipline when you really look at it. But it made me wonder, in 2026, would this even be possible? And I feel like technically no, technically maybe. Technically, every DA's office in California now has a written conflicts policy that requires Stone to disclose his temple role, accused from anything temple adjacent, and he would probably resign or be fired if the role was as central as Stone's was. The state bar has stronger conflict rules. They have the model rules of professional conduct, which California finally adopted a version of in 2018, and those rules are more explicit. And federal civil rights law has expanded what counts as basically a deprivable interest. So bar discipline for undisclosed dual representation is much more likely now than it was in 1975. But I feel like practically the same dynamic could happen, just more quietly. Let me just do some hypothesizing, okay? If a politically connected lawyer in 2026 were to quietly represent a religious organization while working in a DA's office, and the DA was politically aligned with that organization, I feel like the same chilling effects on complaints could operate. It would just be less visible on the resume. The thing that has changed since 1975 is more so from what I'm seeing is the documentation requirements, not the underlying incentive structure. So the system, it kind of still rewards prosecutors who are loyal to political coalitions. It still punishes whistleblowers. It still treats well-connected defendants better than poor defendants. I think the Stolen scenario was extreme, but when I look at it, it's not unique. It's more of an extreme expression of a normal pattern, and that normal pattern, I think, is still kind of normal. But the reason Joseph hired Stolen in the first place, I think itself is worth knowing because Joseph was a Burton machine DA. He got elected on the same Temple turnout wave that elected Moscone. So when the Temple's general counsel showed up looking for a job, Joseph owed him a job, the same way Moscone owed Jones the housing authority chairmanship. The hiring was patronage. It was not Joseph saying, this is the best lawyer for the consumer fraud division. It was him saying, I owe these people, and putting their guy in my office is just the way I have to pay up. And then the paycheck or the payback for the payback came when the Stolens deflected and started fighting for John Victor, little boy right here. And Joseph himself officially intervened on the Stolen side. According to Stolen's own case statement, the court order demanded that the San Francisco district attorney take all actions necessary to secure Reverend Jim Jones' compliance with this order. And Joseph wrote the letters. November 25th, 1977, the district attorney of San Francisco Jr. sent an official letter to the following persons requesting each to use whatever influence you have to help us obtain Reverend Jones' compliance. So after Stolen flipped, the DA's office was officially on Stolen's side on the custody battle, which itself is a conflict of interest because the DA had previously employed Stolen and the DA had previously been aligned with the Temple. And now the DA was taking sides in a private custody dispute on behalf of a former employee. Like the whole thing is like a daisy chain of conflicts, and nobody on the inside seems to have stopped to ask whether any of it was just even appropriate. I don't know. It's just like the conflict of interest at the heart of the People's Temple. It's not that one corrupt lawyer slipped through, but I think it's that an entire political coalition built around the Temple's turnout operation was also built around the Temple's lawyer, put him in the DA's office, asked him to investigate the Temple's own election fraud, and were genuinely surprised when he found nothing. And the reason none of these people went to prison is that the system was working exactly the way the system was just designed to work. Nothing's out of order. Now, Angela Davis. Angela Davis is a different category from the elected politicians. She was not a machine politician. She was a movement, intellectual, and Communist Party USA member, and the icon of Black radical tradition. In September 1977, when the Temple was undergoing its first major external pressure, because basically the News West article had just hit, defectors were talking to the press, the IRS was sniffing around, and Jones was already in Guyana with the Jonestown population in panic mode, basically. Angela Davis, she participated in a ham radio broadcast and from the United States into Jonestown, and she addressed the residents directly. And she told them, and this is on tape, and this is also part of the FBI's recovered audio archive. She told them that she stood in solidarity with them, and that she understood that they were under attack by a conspiracy of racists and reactionaries, and that they should hold the line. And in hindsight, that broadcast is unbelievably damaging because it gave the residents of Jonestown the impression that the Black radical left in America stood behind them. And it gave Jones the ammunition to tell the residents that the outside world was the enemy and that the only people they could trust were each other and a handful of allies, including Angela Davis. In the decades since, Miss Davis has spoken very little publicly about this. And when asked, she has typically framed it as a response to what looked like a racist attack on a Black majority church, which is not unreasonable framing of how it looked in September 1977, but it also just doesn't completely age, like, doesn't age the best. I think we got to give her some grace because, like, her perspective from that time frame makes so much sense, and then her not wanting to talk about it also makes so much sense because I believe that she really believed what she was saying to them and that she was very genuine. And then to find out that the very essence of who you are and your words were used against you in a way that you weren't aware of, like, she was manipulated as well, you know? And so were a lot of these people. This is not right. So it's supposed to be, but Jacayla forgot. So it was supposed. So okay. So I'm gonna talk about Dennis Banks and Huey Newton very quickly. Dennis Banks. I guess I could just pop his picture up here like I did before too. Let me do another page. Y'all can tell this was Banks and Mr. Huey Newton. So here's Dennis Banks, and he was fighting extradition from California to South Dakota in the mid 1970s. And Governor Jerry Brown refused to extradite him, and the People's Temple was part of the support network that pressured Brown and provided Banks with resources, legal support, and sanctuary infrastructure. And Banks was, of course, publicly grateful, and he visited the temple and he spoke at services. Then we have Huey Newton. He's a Black Panther founder. He was in exile in Cuba from 1974 to 1977. He was evading prosecution in the U.S., and he corresponded with Jim Jones during that period. He sent supportive letters that Jones read out loud at services, and there was also a mutual ideological affinity because both men positioned themselves as revolutionary socialists targeted by the United States government, and both used that framing to consolidate internal loyalty. And after Jonestown, Newton was one of the very few public radicals who did not fully distance himself. He continued to insist in interviews that Jonestown has been destroyed by U.S. government prosecution rather than destroyed by Jim Jones, which of course is going to be a position that aged very, very badly. And Newton's own subsequent decline, he was murdered in Oakland in 1989 in a drug-related dispute. It just kind of makes the whole thing tragic on multiple sides when you really look at it. Now we get to Jerry Brown. Mr. Jerry Brown was a governor in California from 1975 to 1983, and he attended at least one People's Temple event and had temple support in his campaigns. He wasn't as close as Moscone or Willie Brown were, but he was aware of the temple's political utility, and he did not get in the way of the prosecution arrangements. And after Jonestown, he was spared the worst of the political fallout because his association had just been a lot thinner. And then we got Art Agnos, y'all know I can't talk. But this is a state assemblyman. Later, he became the mayor of San Francisco from 1988 to 1992. He was a Temple ally, and he was literally shot during a separate incident in 1977 by the Zebra murderers, and he survived and he continued his career. And Agnos' connection to the temple was machine typical. It was a turnout in exchange for access, and he had been a candid in his interviews about how embarrassed he was about the whole thing. So, Jim Jones offered every Democratic politician in California 1,000 disciplined bodies on demand, and every politician said yes, because that is what politicians do, and the price of saying yes was looking the other way about whatever was happening inside the building. And that's a lot of the story, and that's a lot of the machine. That is the Tammany Hall in a church suit in San Francisco in 1977. And I just want to land this somewhere useful because I don't want anyone to feel cynical about politics. I kind of feel that way sometimes. That's not the takeaway though I want to have from this. The takeaway is that the system that made Jim Jones possible has not changed. If a Jim Jones walked into San Francisco today with a 1,000-body turnout operation, every politician in the city would just take the meeting, the same dynamic would unfold because the system rewards turnout over scrutiny, and we have not built any institutions in the last 50 years that would change that calculation. Another turnout takeaway I take is that the politicians involved were not stupid and they were not evil, but they were more so operators inside a system that incentivized exactly this kind of relationship. And if you find yourself wanting to feel morally superior to George Moscone or Harvey Milk or Willie Brown because you would have spotted Jim Jones a mile away, I want you to really think about that honestly, because I'm not sure a lot of us would have. He was running a food bank, senior care homes, integrating Black and white worshipers in a country that still mostly did not. And he was publicly doing the things progressives say they want done. And the worst stuff was happening behind closed doors in a building in another country where nobody outside the inner circle could see it. And so I don't know, maybe the lesson is not to not just trust no one. Maybe the lesson is that the machinery of politics will protect the predator who can deliver a turnout. Yeah, the machinery of politics will protect the predator who can deliver turnout. And the only fix for that is institutions that are strong enough to scrutinize the people in power, even when they're useful to your coalition. I think that's a hard lesson, but it's like a grown lesson, and I think it's the right one. But that is all. If you're here, thank you for the bonus episode. This is the political machinery dive, and I wanted to do it because otherwise I would try to do it so much in the other video. So, goodbye.